I'm a 30-year-old guy, and my younger brother Daniel is 28. Growing up, we were close. Not just as siblings, but as best friends. Our parents made sure we did everything together. Same sports teams, same summer camps, even shared birthday parties. But even then, it was obvious Daniel was their favorite. He had this natural charm, the kind of kid who could say something dumb in class and still get a laugh instead of detention. He was athletic, outgoing, and the kind of son parents brag about at family gatherings. I was the quieter one, more into books and computers. I didn't mind, not really. I figured that's just how things were. That unspoken favoritism was always there, but I never thought much about it. It was little things, how they always showed up to his games but forgot about my debate tournaments, how they talked about his future in sports but barely acknowledged my academic achievements. But it wasn't a competition, right? We were brothers. We had each other's backs. That changed a year ago. We were driving home from a family event, just the two of us in my car. It was late, and the road was mostly empty. One minute, we were talking about some dumb movie we had just seen, and the next, headlights were coming straight at us. A car had swerved into our lane way too fast. I barely had time to react before the impact. I woke up in the hospital, groggy but mostly fine, bruises, some stitches, nothing major. Daniel wasn't so lucky. A spinal cord injury left him paralyzed from the waist down. The doctors said he'd never walk again. At first, our parents were relieved I was okay, but that relief disappeared the moment they saw Daniel in that hospital bed. My mother didn't cry, didn't ask me if I was okay. She just looked at me and asked, "Why couldn't it have been you?" My dad stood there silent, staring at me like I had personally put Daniel in that wheelchair. For the first few days, Daniel didn't blame me. We even joked about it, dark humor, the kind that makes nurses uncomfortable. He told me I'd have to push his wheelchair at my wedding, and I laughed because I thought we were still the same. But our parents weren't laughing. They hovered over his bed, whispering when they thought I wasn't listening. He should have done more. He was the one driving. It's not fair. Daniel started changing. It was subtle at first, shorter replies, avoiding eye contact, then came the passive-aggressive comments. When I visited, he'd ask if I was having fun living a normal life. When I brought up anything unrelated to the accident, he shut down. Our parents encouraged it, feeding into his anger. They started treating me like an intruder instead of their son. Then came the moment I knew things had gone too far. My mother pulled me aside and told me I needed to apologize. For what? I asked. For ruining his future, she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I refused. I wasn't going to apologize for surviving. That was the first time I saw real hatred in her eyes. After that, things escalated. Our grandparents had set aside an inheritance for both of us. Equal amounts. Suddenly, my parents decided I didn't need mine anymore. They wanted me to give it all to Daniel, to cover his medical bills, his physical therapy, his new life. I said I'd contribute, but I wasn't giving everything up. That wasn't good enough. They started cutting me out of things. Family dinners, vacations, holidays. I'd find out about them through social media, through cousins posting pictures with captions like "family is everything." While I wasn't even invited, when I confronted them, my mother said, "You made your choice." Daniel echoed their words. "You don't get it. You have everything I lost." As if I hadn't been in the same crash. As if I wasn't in the same car when our lives changed. Friends started taking sides. The ones who had known us for years, who had been to our birthday parties and hung out at our house, started treating me differently. Some believed I had done nothing wrong. Others thought I should be doing more to make things right. "It's just money," one of them said. "Just help him out." I suggested therapy, a neutral third party, someone who could help us talk through it. My mother scoffed. Therapy won't make him walk again. The final straw came when she called me selfish for trying to move on. She asked how I could think about dating when my brother was still suffering. That was when I knew. It didn't matter what I did. They would never see me as anything other than the person who walked away while Daniel didn't. I wasn't their son anymore. I was their scapegoat. A few weeks after I stopped trying to force a relationship with my parents and Daniel, I got a call from a family friend. She hesitated before speaking, which was already a bad sign. Then she dropped the news. My parents had organized a fundraiser for Daniel's medical bills. A big one. Extended family. Old family friends. Even some people from their church had shown up. I hadn't even known about it. At first I thought maybe they assumed I wouldn't want to come. But that thought didn't last long because my name was brought up in the speech. Not to be thanked, not as part of Daniel's support system. They used it to shame me. According to my friend, my father gave this whole speech about how family is supposed to support each other in times of need and how some people have chosen to turn their backs. Then my mother started crying in front of the crowd, talking about how hard it was to see Daniel struggle while some people, meaning me, were living comfortably and doing nothing. The fundraiser was set up with a public donation page, and my name was nowhere to be found. But my parents made sure everyone knew I hadn't contributed. When I saw the pictures online, it was like a slap in the face. Daniel was sitting at the front with our parents, all three of them smiling, surrounded by family and friends. One of the captions from a distant cousin read, "Supporting those who actually deserve it." I didn't even have to ask what that meant. I called my parents. There wasn't even an attempt to deny it. My dad's tone was neutral, almost dismissive, when he told me I should be doing more. I had already offered to help with some expenses, but they wanted everything. Every penny from my inheritance. When I asked if Daniel really felt the same way, my mother cut in, saying, "He wouldn't have to if you had done the right thing from the start." I hung up. I texted Daniel instead. No lectures, no accusations. I just asked him straight up if he really believed I owed him for what happened. His reply was short. "You have everything I lost. You should give something back." That was all I needed to hear. A few days later, I got another call, this time from my grandfather. He controls the inheritance fund, and he wanted to let me know that my parents had tried to access my money without my permission. They even tried to claim power of attorney, arguing that it was for the good of the family. Thankfully, my grandfather refused. He made it clear that I was the only one who could access my inheritance. But the fact that they even tried made my blood run cold. My mother sent a long message that night. She went with full emotional manipulation, talking about how Daniel was suffering every day, how I was lucky to live a normal life, how she didn't raise me to be so selfish. I didn't respond. The next day, mutual friends started reaching out. A few of them actually confronted Daniel, telling him that this wasn't fair to me. His response? Mind your business. That's when the real family pressure started. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who hadn't spoken to me in months were suddenly all over my phone, demanding to know why I was being cruel and why I wouldn't just do the right thing. Some were outright calling me a disgrace. It was like a coordinated attack. And when I didn't respond the way they wanted, my parents changed tactics. They started gaslighting me. I got messages saying I was being dramatic, that no one actually blamed me, that it was all in my head. Meanwhile, Daniel posted a vague tweet that got a lot of attention. Some people show their true colors when times get hard. The comments were exactly what you'd expect. People calling him brave, offering support, asking who betrayed him. A few people tagged me. Then one of my cousins sent me screenshots from a private family group chat. The messages were worse than I expected. My mother had straight up called me a disappointment. My father said I was abandoning Daniel. Some relatives had jumped in, saying I was selfish beyond words. The only person who defended me, my grandfather, he told them all that if they wanted to drain their own bank accounts for Daniel, they were welcome to, but I wasn't obligated to do anything. I decided I needed to talk to Daniel one last time, in person. When I showed up at the house, my mother barely acknowledged me. My father wouldn't look at me, but Daniel was waiting. I told him that I wasn't abandoning him, that I wanted to help, but I wouldn't be manipulated. He just stared at me for a moment, then shook his head. "You'll never understand." That was the last real conversation we had. My father lost his temper that night, said that if I wasn't willing to support Daniel, I wasn't welcome in their house. That was it. No more pretending. Either I gave up my inheritance, or I was out of the family. I made my decision. No more guilt. No more trying to explain myself to people who had already made up their minds. I cut them off. A week later, I finally did what I should have done earlier. I posted my story on Reddit. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I just wanted to know, was I really the bad guy here? Cutting off my parents was supposed to be the end of it. No more drama, no more guilt tripping, no more fights over money that wasn't theirs. But instead of letting it go, they escalated. And this time, they went for something that could have actually ruined me. It started with a bank notification, a flagged transaction attempt. At first, I thought it was some kind of scam, but when I checked, it was my personal savings account. Someone had tried to withdraw money, but the transaction was blocked. That didn't make sense. I was the only one with access. Or at least I was supposed to be. I called my bank immediately. After verifying my identity, they told me someone had tried to access my account using an old joint account login. My parents had set up a joint account for me when I was a teenager, and even though I had separated my finances years ago, they still had old information on file. They attempted to access my account using outdated credentials. The bank flagged the attempt, but what baffled me was their recklessness. Did they really think they could get away with it without triggering security alerts? The bank flagged the attempt as fraud. Since the transfer failed, no money was taken, but now my account had extra security measures in place. The bank suggested filing a police report. I called my parents instead. My mother played dumb. She acted surprised, confused, like she had no idea what I was talking about. But my father, he didn't even bother denying it. "You wouldn't give it willingly," he said, "so we had no choice." They were actually justifying it, like my money was theirs to take. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. For a while, I actually debated pressing charges. But that's the part that got to me. I felt guilty about the idea of reporting them. After everything, they still had me conditioned to feel like I was the problem. Then the news started spreading. I don't know who leaked it first. Maybe my grandfather, maybe one of my aunts, but suddenly extended family knew everything. My phone started blowing up again, but this time the reactions were mixed. Some relatives were horrified. They couldn't believe my own parents had tried to take my money without my permission. But others, they actually defended them. They were just trying to help Daniel. You could have just given them what they needed. Did you really have to make it a big deal? Then Daniel texted me. You could have just helped instead of making it a big deal. That was his response. Not an apology, not even an attempt to justify it, just pure entitlement. At this point, my grandparents stepped in. My dad's siblings, who usually stayed out of family drama, finally called my parents out. My uncle told them they had gone too far, and my grandfather was so angry that he put extra security on my inheritance fund. Now, not only could my parents not touch it, but they wouldn't even be able to try anything else without a lawyer getting involved. My grandmother called me that night. She didn't try to pressure me, didn't tell me to forgive them. She just said she was proud of me for standing my ground. Meanwhile, my friends were in shock. Some of them had seen family drama before, but none of them could believe my parents had actually tried to steal from me. They kept asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I was sure I didn't want to take legal action, but my parents weren't done. A few days later, my mom called again, but this time she was crying. She went on about how I was tearing the family apart, about how Daniel was suffering, about how they were just trying to do what was best. It wasn't an apology, it was a guilt trip. I didn't fall for it. Then Daniel took it public. He posted a long rant on social media about greedy, selfish people who abandon family and some people only care about money. He didn't name me, but everyone knew who he was talking about, and then my father made it official. If you want to be an outsider, he said, then consider yourself cut off. It was supposed to be a punishment, a final way to make me feel like I was losing something, but I didn't lose anything. I finally saw it for what it was. I was never their son. I was their scapegoat. Cutting off my parents should have been the end of it. No more calls, no more guilt trips, no more fights over money, but instead of leaving me alone, they decided to take things to the next level. They tried to destroy my career. It started with an email from HR, a formal notice about an anonymous complaint. The message was vague, only saying that a serious allegation had been made against me and that there would be an investigation. I had never received anything like this before, and immediately something felt off. When I got to the meeting, HR laid it all out. The complaint accused me of making discriminatory remarks against disabled individuals, specifically, my attitude toward disabled family members. That's when it clicked. There was only one group of people who had ever accused me of being insensitive to disabled people. My parents and Daniel. HR took it seriously. They had to. A full investigation was launched. My coworkers were interviewed, and every single one of them backed me up. I had never made any such remarks. I had never mistreated anyone. There was no proof. Still, I needed to know who was behind this. My boss, who fully supported me, let me see the original complaint. The email was a mess. Poorly written, full of dramatic accusations, overly specific details about my family that no one at work would know. It wasn't just badly written. It was obvious that whoever sent it had no idea how HR investigations actually work. I had IT check the email source. They traced the email back to an IP address registered to someone in my parents' neighborhood. It wasn't a direct link to their home, but it was close enough that I knew exactly who was responsible. They had tried covering their tracks, but not well enough. They had actually sat down, typed out a fake complaint, and sent it directly to my workplace in an attempt to get me fired. I called my mother. I didn't even try to be calm this time. She played dumb, like always. Acted shocked. Said she had no idea what I was talking about. Then I mentioned the IP address. Silence. And then, she hung up. A few minutes later, I got a text from Daniel. You deserved a wake-up call. That was all he said. No denial, no defense, just pure spite. HR wrapped up the investigation quickly after that. I was cleared of any wrongdoing. In fact, my boss warned me that if my family continued to harass me, I could pursue legal action. My mother sent another long message the next day. We were just trying to hold you accountable. That was their excuse. Not an apology, not regret, just more justification for their actions. By then, the news had spread to extended family. Some relatives were horrified. Others, they told me to let it go. They're your parents. They were just desperate. Maybe you should have helped more. That was it for me. I was done. I contacted a lawyer and had a cease and desist letter sent to my parents. It was officially documented now. If they tried anything again, I'd take legal action. Daniel wasn't finished, though. A few days later, he went on another social media meltdown. He posted about how I was cold and heartless, how families should take care of each other, how some people only care about themselves. He still didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew. Then something unexpected happened. One of my cousins, someone who had originally taken their side, reached out. This is going too far. That was all they said. But it was enough. That's when I realized this wasn't about guilt anymore. They weren't just trying to manipulate me into helping Daniel. They were actively trying to destroy my life. After the HR stunt failed, I thought maybe, just maybe, they would back off. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that my parents don't quit when they're losing. They double down. I got home from work late one evening, exhausted, ready to just crash. As soon as I stepped out of my car, I saw them, standing right outside my apartment building. They weren't here for a friendly visit. Before I could even say anything, my father marched toward me, voice raised, loud enough that people were starting to watch. He was furious, going on about how I was tearing the family apart and how I had left Daniel to suffer while I lived my perfect life. My mother took a different approach. Tears, full sobbing, acting like I was some heartless monster who had abandoned them in their time of need. And then came the real reason they were here. They wanted money. Not a one-time thing, a monthly payment. Something reasonable to help Daniel adjust, so that I wouldn't have to feel guilty anymore. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was insane. I told them straight up, I didn't owe them anything. Not a cent. That's when my father lost it. He shoved past me, trying to force his way inside the building, yelling, calling me a selfish, ungrateful brat, making a whole scene right there in the lobby. I didn't even have to call security. A neighbor did it for me. Within minutes, a security guard was there, escorting them out. People in the building were staring, whispering. My mother kept up the act, crying, but my father kept fighting until he was finally dragged out the door. I thought that was the end of it. Then that night, I got a text from Daniel. Either you help me, or you're dead to me. That was it. No more playing nice. I blocked his number. Then I blocked both my parents' numbers. The next day, I went straight to a lawyer and filed a restraining order. I was done waiting for them to finally respect my boundaries. They weren't going to stop, so I had to make them stop. And of course, that's when the family group chat exploded. Some relatives were horrified at what my parents had done. Others, they still defended them. They just want what's best for Daniel. You didn't have to go this far, but they're still your parents. I ignored it all. I was done explaining myself. Just to be safe, I informed my job about the situation in case my parents tried another stunt. My boss was completely on my side, telling me to document everything. Then the final guilt trip came. My mom sent me an email. Long, emotional, full of dramatic nonsense. When we die, you'll regret this. I didn't even open it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a weight had been lifted. But I also knew they weren't done. So I did what I should have done from the start. I shared another post on Reddit, and the overwhelming support. It reassured me of one thing. I wasn't the villain here. I thought cutting them off would be the end of it. No more drama. No more chaos. I was wrong. A few weeks after I blocked my parents and Daniel, a cousin, one who had originally defended them, reached out. At first I thought they were just going to guilt trip me again, but what they told me changed everything. Daniel's medical fund was a lie. My cousin had seen him spending money like crazy. A brand new gaming setup, designer clothes, even a vacation. None of it made sense. Where was the money coming from? Daniel wasn't working, and my parents were always complaining about finances. It didn't take long to find out. Daniel had convinced multiple family members to donate to his so-called medical fund, and people had given a lot. A mutual friend sent me screenshots from Daniel's private Instagram. He had been flaunting everything, showing off expensive new purchases, eating at high-end restaurants, living like nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, my parents were still begging for more donations. I needed proof, so I called my grandfather. He had access to some of the financial details, especially since he had refused to give Daniel my inheritance. I asked how much of the money had actually gone toward medical expenses. The answer? Barely any. I sent Daniel a text. Nothing accusatory, just a simple question. Where was the money really going? He blocked me. That was confirmation enough. Word started spreading. Some of the relatives who had donated were furious. They had believed the money was helping with medical bills and physical therapy, not funding luxury purchases. One cousin decided to confront my mother. Her response? He deserves nice things after everything he's lost. There was no regret, no shame. She actually believed Daniel was entitled to it. My father was no better. He insisted it was Daniel's money to spend as he pleased. Then, the real problem started. A distant uncle, one of the biggest donors, found out, and he wasn't taking it lightly. He had given a significant amount and was now threatening legal action. Daniel tried to get ahead of it with a social media rant. He went off about how people only care about money and how no one understood his struggles. He tried playing the victim, acting like he had no choice, that he was just trying to find happiness. At first, Daniel's sob story got sympathy, but this time more people asked questions. Some of his past supporters tried defending him, but even they hesitated when others pointed out his extravagant spending. The cracks in his narrative started showing and fewer people were willing to blindly support him. Some family members who had initially defended Daniel hesitated. At first, they downplayed the fraud, calling it a mistake. But as more evidence surfaced, especially financial records showing how little had gone to actual medical bills, even his strongest supporters started distancing themselves. A few relatives clung to the idea that Daniel had just made bad choices, but most eventually backed away. My parents, they doubled down. They called me, furious, blaming me for turning people against Daniel. But they weren't fooling anyone anymore. Relatives started demanding refunds, and Daniel, he went completely silent. Then, in the middle of all the chaos, I got one last call, from my grandmother. She had never taken sides before, always tried to stay neutral. But this time, all she said was, maybe you should have been the one we favored after all. After Daniel's scam started unraveling, I knew it was only a matter of time before things got worse, and I was right. It started in the family group chat. One of my distant uncles, the same one who had donated a large sum to Daniel's medical fund, finally called him out. He demanded receipts. He had given Daniel money under the impression that it was covering medical bills, therapy sessions, home modifications, things Daniel actually needed. But with everything coming to light, he wanted proof of where his money went. Daniel had nothing. No receipts, no medical invoices. Nothing. Instead of answering, he got defensive, told people they should just trust him, said he didn't have to prove anything because it was his money now. That's when the legal threats started. The uncle made it very clear. If Daniel didn't show proof, he'd sue for fraud, and that's when my parents panicked. For months, they had backed him completely, defended him, enabled him. But now that lawsuits were being thrown around, suddenly they started backpedaling. They called the whole thing a misunderstanding. They said Daniel had spent money on medical bills, just not all of it. They tried damage control, insisting this was all blown out of proportion. But it was too late. Some relatives remained defensive, refusing to believe Daniel had done anything malicious. Others, faced with undeniable proof, reluctantly admitted they had been fooled. A handful turned against my parents entirely, disgusted by their manipulation. But not everyone changed their minds overnight. Some still wanted to believe Daniel had been a victim of his circumstances. The ones who had defended him realized they had been manipulated. And Daniel, he went into full meltdown mode. His social media became a train wreck of vague, guilt-tripping posts. Everyone abandoned me. No one understands what it's like. I have nothing left. But the worst part? An aunt of mine, someone who works in finance, decided to dig deeper. She checked Daniel's spending history, and she found everything. Thousands spent on gaming consoles, designer clothes, luxury gadgets, expensive takeout orders, money that had been donated for medical expenses, wasted. At a small family gathering, Daniel finally got confronted. My uncle, the same one threatening to sue, put him on the spot. He asked one simple question: where did my $10,000 go? My parents tried to intervene, but Daniel had no answer, no excuse. He just sat there in silence. And then, my father snapped. At first, my father tried to smooth things over, claiming the accusations were exaggerated. But when legal threats started coming in, his attitude shifted. He pulled Daniel aside, whispering in hushed, tense voices. My mother still clung to her defense of him, but my father wasn't willing to sink with Daniel's ship. They weren't cutting him off out of principle, just self-preservation. He threatened to evict Daniel, his own golden child. Because at the end of the day, my father cared more about his own reputation than about Daniel's mess. That's when the desperation set in. My mother pleaded with extended family, told them we can fix this, said it was all just a mistake, but no one was buying it anymore. At this point, Daniel's former supporters started publicly calling him out. People who had once been on his side started asking for refunds. And Daniel, he went radio silent. Then, my parents tried one last time. They called me. And of course they blamed me. According to them, if I had just helped him from the beginning, none of this would have happened. I let them rant, let them dig their own grave. Then, when they finally stopped talking, I told them exactly what they didn't want to hear. You raised a liar. You enabled him. And now you're dealing with the consequences. Not me. Then I hung up. Later that night, I posted my update on Reddit. Thousands of people flooded the comments, most of them saying the same thing: cut them off completely. And for the first time, I actually considered it. Because for once, my parents couldn't cover for Daniel anymore, and he was finally facing the fallout of his own lies. I knew something was coming when my parents reached out after weeks of silence. They wanted to have a family meeting. I didn't trust it, not after everything. But curiosity got the best of me. I agreed to meet them, in a public place. No way was I stepping foot in their house again. The moment I arrived, I could tell what this was. A setup. My mother started with the usual emotional act, talking about family, forgiveness, second chances. My father kept his arms crossed, barely making eye contact. And Daniel, he sat there staring at his hands, looking like a kid forced into an apology. Then they got to the point. They begged me for money, not for themselves, for Daniel. They wanted me to help him fix everything, to pay off the family members demanding refunds, to help him get back on his feet. And then my father actually said it. You're doing fine, but he's struggling. That's when I knew for sure. Nothing had changed. I didn't even hesitate. I told them I don't financially support con artists. That's when my father lost it. He went from silent to shouting in seconds, calling me a selfish disgrace. My mother sobbed, shaking her head, talking about how I was heartless. And then Daniel, he finally spoke. He tried to play nice, said he messed up, said he was desperate, told me he was sorry. So I asked him one simple question. If I give you money, will you ever stop needing more? He had no answer. Silence, because we both knew the truth. This wouldn't be the last time. That's when my parents pulled out their final manipulation attempt. They threatened to cut me out of their will. I laughed, told them I'd rather they donate it to charity. And that was the moment everything broke apart completely. After that, the family divide was permanent. Some relatives refused to support my parents or Daniel anymore. Even the ones who had defended them started distancing themselves. Daniel was officially shunned by most of the family. Even his biggest defenders realized they had been played. Word spread fast. His reputation was ruined. Friends who once stood by him started distancing themselves. Even people from his old job found out about his scam. Then came the last desperate plea. My mother called one final time, begging me to at least help him find a job. I didn't even hesitate. That's not my problem. And that was the last time we spoke. With no more financial support, Daniel finally had to look for work instead of begging. And my parents? They finally went silent. For the first time in years, I felt free. No guilt, no manipulation. Nothing tying me to them anymore. Looking back, this was the best decision I ever made. I was done. Completely. After months of burning bridges, Daniel was finally out of options. The family had turned on him. Even the distant relatives who had once supported him had backed away, realizing he was nothing but a user. No one trusted him anymore. Even my parents started distancing themselves. It turns out, once Daniel became more of a liability than an asset, they weren't so eager to keep defending him. But of course he didn't go down quietly. Instead of taking responsibility, he tried one last scam. He reached out to several family members, spinning a new sob story. This time it wasn't about medical bills. It was about how he was being unfairly shunned. He claimed he was the victim, that everyone had turned against him for no reason, that he was being left to suffer while his selfish brother thrived. Nobody bought it. The donations he expected to flood in, they never came. And then it finally happened. My parents kicked him out. After everything, after years of enabling him, they finally had enough. Or rather, they realized they couldn't afford to keep him anymore. They had spent so much time focusing on Daniel's needs that they never planned for their own. And when Daniel stopped bringing in sympathy money, he became expendable. Daniel had no job, no savings, nowhere to go. And that's when I got one last message. An unknown number. It was Daniel. He didn't ask for an apology, didn't try to manipulate me with guilt. He just sent a simple message. Are you really gonna let me be homeless? I read it twice. Then I sent my final response. You did this to yourself. Then I blocked the number. For the first time, I knew this was truly the end. And then the real karma hit. With Daniel out of the house, my parents lost their last excuse for demanding money from the family. No more. We need help for Daniel. No more. He's struggling and you're selfish. They had nothing left to leverage. And suddenly they were alone. The same family members they had once guilt-tripped into donating were no longer picking up their calls. Even their closest friends finally saw through them. And the best part, many of my extended relatives privately reached out to me. Some even apologized for doubting me. They told me they had watched everything unfold, and they admired how I handled it. I wasn't the villain they had been led to believe. And the difference in my life, immediate. The peace and quiet was incredible. No more late-night phone calls. No more family members trying to pressure me. No more threats. No more manipulation. No more guilt. I focused on my own life. New career opportunities. Healthy relationships. A life that was fully my own. Then just when I thought I had heard the last of Daniel, a cousin told me he had tried one last desperate move. He set up another fundraiser. This time the description was even more dramatic. Something about being cast out by his own family and needing a fresh start. Guess how much money he raised? Nothing. Not a single donation. Even strangers could see through his act now. His reputation? Destroyed. My parents? Not far behind. The people who had once blindly defended them stopped responding to their messages. Even their church group, where they had played the role of struggling parents, cut ties. And the ultimate irony. My mother had once told me, when we die you'll regret this. But the only thing I regretted, not cutting them off sooner. Because the best thing you can do for toxic people isn't to argue with them. It isn't to try and fix them. It's to let them face the consequences of their own actions. And I did. After my last post, thousands of people messaged me saying they wished they had my strength. But I don't think it was about strength. I think it was about finally realizing I was never the problem. And for the first time in my life, I was free. And I never looked back. I 29M grew up with this cabin that my mom's family owned for decades. It was tucked away by a lake, surrounded by thick woods where my mom used to take my siblings and me camping. It was nothing fancy, a bit rundown actually, but it had character, with creaky wooden floors, a wood-burning stove, and walls covered in photos of our family trips over the years. My mom loved that place. And even though she passed away when I was 17, the cabin was where I felt closest to her. Back then, my dad promised we'd keep it in the family. He talked about it like it was our legacy, something we'd pass down. So I assumed it was just a matter of time before he'd hand it down to me, or one of my siblings. But then he remarried, and things started shifting in subtle but uncomfortable ways. His new wife, my stepmom, moved in a few years ago. At first she seemed nice enough, but after a while it felt like she wanted to erase every memory of my mom. The family photos disappeared from the living room, and she redecorated in this ultra-modern style that looked nothing like the cozy home I grew up in. I didn't say much because I thought, it's Dad's life. Let him do what he wants. But the cabin felt different. It was too tied to Mom and our memories together. I didn't expect them to mess with that. Then, a few months ago, I started noticing little signs that my dad might be struggling with money. He mentioned a couple of bad investments but brushed it off whenever I tried to dig deeper. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. Around this time, whenever I'd bring up the cabin, just casual stuff like planning a weekend there or maybe making small repairs, he'd quickly change the topic or say we'd talk about it later. One day, I stopped by my dad's house, hoping to catch him alone. My stepmom was out, so I thought it would be a good time. We got to talking, and out of the blue, he drops the bombshell he sold the cabin. No warning, no heads up. Just I sold the cabin last month. I remember just sitting there trying to process it. This place, the one thing left that felt like my mom, was gone. And he didn't even tell me until it was over. I felt like I'd been hit in the gut. All I could manage to say was, why? Dad went on about how he needed the money and how it was the only option given his financial situation. He acted like it was no big deal, like it was just a property he could sell whenever he wanted. But this wasn't just some random asset. It was part of our family, our history, and he just let it go without so much as a conversation. When I asked who bought it, he got all vague, saying it was a private buyer and not to worry about it. That made it feel even worse. Who were these people? What would they do to the cabin? The whole thing felt off. I was angry, and I didn't hold back. I told him exactly what I thought, that he was selfish, that he should have at least talked to me first, that he had no right to do this behind my back. His response: "If you want it so badly, why don't you just buy it back?" It felt like he'd slapped me. Here he was, the person who sold it without a word to me, now telling me I should just buy it back. As if it was some kind of test, like he was challenging me to prove how much I cared about it. I was still in shock, and I think he knew that, but he didn't let up. My stepmom had come home by then, and she chimed in, saying something about how I should step up if the cabin meant that much to me. But here's the kicker: they knew I didn't have that kind of money. They'd sold it at a time when I was just trying to make ends meet, and I had no idea this was coming. Saving up to buy back a cabin that should have already been ours wasn't even on my radar. Later that night, I took to Reddit, just trying to get my thoughts down. I posted about everything that had happened, how blindsided I felt, and how it seemed like my dad was playing some kind of sick game. The responses were overwhelming. People were equally shocked and angry on my behalf. Some folks even suggested I should start a GoFundMe or take out a loan, while others told me to cut my losses and move on. But how do you just move on from something that ties you to your childhood, to your mom? The comments were a mix. Some thought my dad had no right to do what he did, and others were like, it's his property, he can do what he wants. There was a lot of debate, but mostly people seemed to get why I was hurt. They shared stories of their own about family betrayals and things they'd lost that they'd never get back. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just let it go. I didn't have the funds to buy it outright, but I couldn't just sit back and watch everything my mom loved get erased because my dad needed cash. The idea of my mom's favorite place getting torn down or flipped into some trendy rental made me sick. So now I'm stuck in this limbo, not sure what to do next. I'm trying to figure out who bought it and if there's any chance I can get it back, but every time I talk to my dad, it's just more of the same. He keeps acting like this is my problem now, like I'm the one causing trouble by even bringing it up. And it doesn't end there. My stepmom keeps dropping hints that this is some kind of lesson, that if I want to prove myself, I'll find a way to buy it back. It's exhausting, honestly. I'm not sure if they're testing me, teaching me, or just trying to push me away, but whatever it is, I'm not letting go without a fight. I'll post an update as soon as I figure out my next steps. Right now, I'm just trying to keep my head above water and figure out if there's even a chance I can get the cabin back. Update 1. After my initial post, I knew I needed to dig into what actually happened with the cabin. First, I went to the county records office to see if I could find anything on the sale. Turns out my dad sold the place to a private buyer through a cash deal, which made the transaction airtight and left almost no paper trail I could follow. The whole situation felt so calculated. My dad had never mentioned the cabin was even up for sale, so to find out he went with a private buyer in a quick, cash-only sale just didn't sit right with me. I tried asking around in our family circle, hoping someone knew more than I did, but all I got was either dead ends or people trying to avoid the subject. It seemed like everyone was keeping quiet or didn't want to get involved. I reached out to a couple of cousins on my mom's side who were just as shocked as I was. They couldn't believe my dad would do this without giving us a chance to buy it first. One of them mentioned that my stepmom had been talking about starting fresh and hinted that the cabin was too much of a burden for my dad. That comment confirmed what I'd been feeling. My stepmom probably had a hand in this whole thing. Meanwhile, word started spreading among the rest of the family. My dad's side of the family mostly kept their opinions to themselves, but I could tell they weren't exactly sympathetic. Some of them hinted that my dad had done what he had to do, implying that selling the cabin was somehow justified. This divide in the family made everything more complicated, and it felt like I was standing alone in all of it. As I kept pushing, I learned that the buyer was willing to sell the cabin back to me, but at a much higher price than what my dad received. It was insulting. They knew it was a sentimental property and seemed to be taking advantage of my connection to it. I was stuck between wanting the cabin back and knowing I was being manipulated by both the buyer and my own family. But I knew that if I let it go, I'd regret it forever. In the meantime, every conversation with my dad felt like walking into a trap. He kept pushing me to step up and buy it back if it was so important to me. My stepmom, of course, would chime in with comments about how real family shows their commitment by making sacrifices. They even brought it up at a family dinner, practically turning it into a public guilt trip. I didn't say much then, but I left early that night, more determined than ever to get the cabin back somehow. To get started, I began looking around for ways to raise money. I didn't have much saved, so I started listing anything I could sell online. A few friends noticed and reached out, asking what was going on. When I explained the situation, they offered to help. Some even pitched in by buying items I was selling just to support me. Their support made things feel a bit more hopeful, but I still had a long way to go to match the inflated price the new owner was asking. The whole ordeal with my dad was becoming unbearable. Every time we talked, he'd drop hints about how he and my stepmom had sacrificed so much and that now it was my turn to prove my dedication. It felt like a twisted game they were playing. I was trying to wrap my head around whether this was some kind of test or if they just wanted me to give up. Either way, the pressure was relentless, and I knew I couldn't keep going like this without taking bigger steps. So I started looking into loan options. The thought of going into debt for this was terrifying, especially since I wasn't exactly financially stable. I knew this decision could set me back, but the alternative was losing the one place that still felt like home. I shared my worries with Reddit, and the response was incredible. People shared advice, offered emotional support, and even shared their own stories of family betrayals and struggles with sentimentality versus financial reality. Their words were a boost I hadn't realized I needed. As the days passed, my dad started pushing even harder. He called me out of the blue one night, saying he'd found another buyer and that I needed to make a decision soon. I tried to ask who the buyer was, but he wouldn't tell me, just saying they were serious and ready to move fast. This felt like another manipulation, but I was starting to wonder if he was bluffing just to get me to make a rushed decision. The timing was too perfect. With my back against the wall, I felt like I had no choice. I posted again, updating everyone on Reddit about the situation and asking if anyone had experience with negotiating in a situation like this. Some people suggested calling my dad's bluff, but others were saying I should be careful not to lose my chance. The pressure was eating me alive, and each day that passed, the cabin felt like it was slipping further out of reach. That night, I lay awake, going over my options again and again. The thought of taking out a loan was risky, but my friends and even some extended family from my mom's side were offering to pitch in, and it felt like a team effort. If I kept moving, maybe I could gather enough to buy it back in time. But every interaction with my dad felt like another wall going up between us. He and my stepmom were making it clear that if I didn't buy it soon, they'd have no problem selling it to someone else. I knew the clock was ticking, and I'd have to decide soon. Either I take the plunge and try to pull the funds together, or I let go and lose the cabin for good. I'll update here once I figure out my next steps, but right now it feels like I'm running out of time, and the walls are closing in. Update 2. After my last update, I knew I had to act fast if I wanted any chance of getting the cabin back. So I turned to my extended family for help. I reached out to aunts, uncles, cousins, anyone who had a connection to the cabin or to my mom's memory. Some relatives were sympathetic and even offered to pitch in, seeing it as a way to honor my mom. Others, especially on my dad's side, weren't so supportive. A couple of my uncles seemed uncomfortable, saying I should respect my dad's decision and that maybe I was being unrealistic about it all. Meanwhile, my stepmom found out about my fundraising attempts, and things got ugly. She started calling me selfish, saying I was only making things harder for everyone. At one family dinner, she made a big deal out of how I was stuck in the past, and that the cabin was a burden my dad had to get rid of. She insisted I should move on and let my dad live his life without clinging to old memories. My dad stayed quiet through the whole thing, which made it even worse. Despite that drama, my friends rallied behind me. A couple of close friends suggested we organize a fundraiser event, something simple, like a community BBQ where people could pitch in a few bucks to help out. I honestly didn't expect much, but the turnout surprised me. People from my town, some I hadn't seen in years, showed up. They knew how much the cabin meant to me, and their support gave me a huge boost. Even small donations started trickling in, which, little by little, began to make a difference. But as I kept pushing forward, a few friends pulled me aside and shared their doubts. They were supportive, but they questioned whether I was too emotionally attached, especially if going after the cabin meant driving a wedge between me and my dad. They didn't want to see me get hurt, and a couple even hinted that maybe I was better off letting it go. Those conversations were hard to swallow, but I couldn't just let go after coming this far. Around this time, something strange happened. I noticed inconsistencies in my dad's story about the sale. He had originally said he sold the cabin because he needed the money, but then he'd drop hints about how the buyer just made an offer he couldn't refuse. It didn't add up. So I did some digging, and a cousin from my mom's side mentioned that my dad had been struggling with debt I'd known nothing about. It seemed like he hadn't been entirely honest about his motives, which made me wonder if there was more he was hiding. Some commenters on Reddit encouraged me to consult a lawyer, so I looked into it. I didn't have the money for a lengthy legal battle, but the lawyer I spoke with gave me some tips on how to handle negotiations. He said that if the current buyer was willing to negotiate, I should jump on it and see if I could bring down the price before getting tied up in anything costly. I reached out to the buyer and asked if they'd be open to a lower price, but they were firm. They said they'd consider a slight reduction, but I'd need to make a decision quickly. It felt like a high-pressure tactic, but I was willing to consider it. Every bit counted at this point, so I told them I'd do my best to get the money together by their deadline. Meanwhile, my mom's side of the family, who had been incredibly supportive, decided to organize their own fundraiser. They saw it as a way to honor my mom's memory, and they reached out to old family friends who had known her. This show of support from them meant a lot, but it also seemed to push my stepmom over the edge. She started saying things like, "The cabin was never promised to you," and implied that my dad had always intended to sell it. Her hostility grew with each step I took, and every time we crossed paths, the tension was almost unbearable. With my stepmom becoming more vocal, my dad chose to avoid me altogether. He'd dodge my calls, and when I stopped by his place, he was too busy to talk. It was like he'd put up a wall, letting my stepmom handle the fallout instead. That made everything feel even more isolating, as if he'd fully sided with her against me. While sorting through some old things for the fundraisers, I came across one of my mom's journals. Inside, she'd written about her dreams for the cabin, how she'd hoped it would be a place her kids could visit for years to come. She'd talked about planting trees with us, adding little upgrades over time, and how she envisioned family gatherings there. Finding that journal entry felt like a reminder of why I was fighting so hard for it. But all this was taking a toll. I ended up stepping away from Reddit for a bit to gather myself. The constant stress, the family arguments, the uncertainty, it was all starting to wear me down. I needed a break, even if just for a day or two, to clear my head. When I eventually logged back on, the flood of supportive messages and comments gave me that push I needed to keep going. People were rooting for me, telling me not to give up, and sharing their own stories of family drama and resilience. With everyone's help, we hit a major fundraising milestone that brought us closer to the inflated price. Friends and family chipped in what they could, and the fundraisers were helping. We weren't there yet, but the goal was starting to feel a little more within reach. I'll post again soon as things progress. For now, the plan is to keep raising funds, and hopefully I'll have a solid offer for the buyer soon. Update 3. With the fundraising making steady progress, I reached out to the buyer to see if they'd be willing to budge on the price. After some back and forth, they finally offered a slight reduction, not much, but enough to give me a bit of hope. It felt like a small victory, but I still had a long way to go, and time was ticking. Around this time, my dad's attitude shifted. When I told him about my progress and the possibility of buying the cabin back, he got cold. He started dropping comments about how responsibility isn't cheap and warned me about the financial burden of maintaining the place. He seemed almost resentful, like he wanted me to understand the cost of holding on to old memories. His reaction felt strange, considering how supportive he'd been of keeping the cabin in the family before my stepmom came into the picture. I needed answers, so I confronted him directly. I asked why he'd really sold the cabin and pressed him about the financial situation he was facing. At first, he tried to dodge the question, but eventually he let slip that he had massive debts, much bigger than he'd let on. It became clear that the sale of the cabin wasn't just about moving on or starting fresh with my stepmom, it was about covering up a financial mess he'd been hiding for years. Hearing this made everything click. His urgency to sell, the way he avoided discussing the cabin, the dismissive attitude, he was desperate, and I was caught in the crossfire of his financial disaster. The revelation didn't change my determination, but it made me realize just how deep this situation went. Some Redditors suggested I consider a legal route, maybe even sue to reverse the sale, but I knew that option was risky and probably wouldn't work. After consulting a lawyer, I learned that since the sale was legally binding and the buyer had no involvement in my dad's situation, reversing it would be next to impossible. The only option left was to keep pushing for the funds or walk away. As word of the debt spread through our extended family, some relatives on my dad's side began pressuring him to help cover the remaining costs. They argued that if he was responsible for the sale, he should contribute to the buyback. This only made things worse between us. My stepmom went as far as to say that if I didn't back off, she'd cut off all contact. She claimed I was harassing them and making the family look bad by stirring up drama. Her hostility only made me more determined, but it was hard not to feel the strain with each conversation. With the buyer's reduced offer, I started seriously considering taking out a loan to bridge the gap. It was a tough choice, as the financial risk was significant, and the thought of debt was weighing on me. But every day brought me closer to the possibility of reclaiming the cabin, and the idea of letting it slip away felt even worse. At one point, the stress reached a breaking point. After another argument with my dad, I felt like I was hitting a wall. I started questioning if fighting for the cabin was worth it, especially if it meant tearing apart my relationship with him. For the first time, I considered walking away and letting go, but my friends and family from my mom's side stepped in, reassuring me that I was doing the right thing. Their support kept me grounded, reminding me of why I'd started this journey in the first place. Around this time, I met with the lawyer again to discuss the legal side of things. He confirmed that taking legal action would likely go nowhere. The buyer was well within their rights, and my dad had made sure the sale was locked tight. Any loopholes I'd hoped to find simply weren't there. It was another dead end, but it pushed me to double down on raising the funds. A few friends from my hometown decided to organize a community fundraiser event. They set up a BBQ and some live music, inviting locals to come out and support. The turnout was incredible, with people from all over the community pitching in to help. Even small donations added up, and seeing so many people come together gave me a renewed sense of purpose. It was a reminder that this wasn't just my fight, it was a collective effort, with everyone pulling for me to get that cabin back. Meanwhile, my Reddit post started gaining traction outside of the subreddit. People were sharing it on other platforms, and I noticed a spike in donations. Strangers were reaching out, sharing stories of their own family struggles, and offering advice or simply words of encouragement. It felt surreal to have this kind of support from people I'd never met, but every message, every donation, and every story shared kept me moving forward. Finally, I reached out to the buyer one last time for a final negotiation. I explained my situation, my connection to the cabin, and the fundraising efforts. After a long pause, they agreed to reduce the price even further, but on one condition: I'd have to close quickly. It felt like a race against time, but with the new price, it finally felt within reach. As I prepared to make the offer, the reality of what I was about to do set in. This was it, the culmination of months of effort, arguments, and endless fundraising. I knew that securing the cabin wouldn't come without consequences. My relationship with my dad was already fractured, and my stepmom had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with me. Reclaiming the cabin would likely come at the cost of whatever family connections I had left on that side. But as I looked back on everything that had happened, I felt more certain than ever that this was worth it. The cabin was more than just a piece of property. It was a piece of my mom, a place where our memories lived on. Now, with the finish line in sight, I'm closer than ever to bringing it back into the family, no matter the fallout that follows. I'll update soon with what happens next. Update 4. After months of struggling, I finally managed to buy the cabin back. It was a bittersweet victory. I'd done it, but the family drama left a permanent scar. The cabin was officially mine again, but my dad and stepmom cut off all contact. The family rift felt deeper than ever, with some relatives taking my side and others standing by my dad. I tried to focus on the win, though. After everything, the cabin was back in my hands. The day I returned to the cabin for the first time since the sale, I realized how much work it needed. It looked like no one had bothered with maintenance since I'd last been there. The roof had leaks, the wood was rotting in some places, and the inside was full of dust and cobwebs. Part of me wondered if my dad had let it fall into disrepair on purpose. It was going to take a lot of time and money to bring it back to how I remembered it. My mom's side of the family stepped in right away. They saw this as a chance to honor her memory, and they offered to help with the renovations. Some of them even brought over supplies, saying it was their way of contributing to the cabin she loved so much. It was touching to see everyone come together, working late into the night to make the place livable again. Even people from the community who knew my mom showed up to lend a hand, and it started feeling like the cabin was more than just mine. It was a piece of everyone who cared about her. On Reddit, the support poured in. People celebrated the success with me, sharing their own stories of family betrayals and the lengths they'd gone to hold on to memories. The post went viral, spreading to other platforms, and strangers from all over reached out to say they were inspired. Some even donated small amounts to help with the repairs, which was more than I could have asked for. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Relatives on my dad's side were split. Some of them were supportive, saying I'd earned it after all the effort, while others echoed my stepmom's sentiments. They said I was tearing the family apart by pushing so hard to get the cabin back. My stepmom even confronted me about it, accusing me of turning everyone against my dad. She claimed he had no choice but to sell the cabin, and that I was selfish for refusing to understand. I didn't argue with her. At this point, I knew we'd never see eye to eye. The cabin renovations turned into a kind of therapy for me. There was something therapeutic about fixing up the place myself. As I patched up the roof, painted the walls, and scrubbed away years of neglect, it felt like I was rebuilding a part of myself too. My friends joined in whenever they could, bringing supplies, helping with repairs, and even organizing potluck dinners to keep everyone's spirits up. The whole process felt like a community effort, and it reminded me that I wasn't alone. The repairs were taking a toll on my finances, though. The cabin needed more work than I'd anticipated, and costs started piling up fast. Every time I'd think I'd saved enough to cover a major repair, something else would come up. But I couldn't bring myself to slow down. The cabin had become a symbol of everything I'd fought for, and I wasn't about to give up now, no matter the cost. While cleaning out a storage closet, I found an old box of my mom's belongings. Inside were letters, photos, and little keepsakes from our family trips. Holding those memories in my hands made me feel closer to her, like she was still a part of this place. It was a powerful reminder of why I'd gone through all this trouble. I knew then that no matter what happened with my dad or stepmom, I'd made the right choice. As the story spread, donations and support continued to come in. People online were invested in the journey, with many sharing their own experiences of strained family relationships and the lengths they'd gone to preserve memories. The support was overwhelming, and it even attracted a few small local news outlets. The attention wasn't something I'd expected, but it kept me motivated to finish what I'd started. Then, out of the blue, my dad reached out. He didn't apologize or try to make amends, but he did acknowledge that maybe he'd acted in haste. He admitted that his financial issues were worse than he'd let on and said he regretted how things had gone. However, he made it clear he wasn't ready to reconcile. It was a strange conversation. There was regret in his voice, but no real apology or willingness to make things right. I accepted that this might be the closest we'd get to a resolution. I couldn't change his decisions, and it wasn't my job to make him see my side. I'd reclaimed the cabin, and that was enough. As for my stepmom, she made it clear she wanted no part of my life moving forward, and honestly, I was okay with that. I'd come to terms with the fact that some family ties might never heal. Finally, after weeks of hard work, the cabin was restored. It wasn't perfect, but it was home again. Friends, family, and even a few community members gathered to celebrate, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. We laughed, shared stories about my mom, and even made a toast to her memory. It was a bittersweet ending, but one that felt right. I'll be using the cabin as a retreat, a place to reconnect and build new memories. This journey taught me more than I ever expected about resilience, family, and the power of a community. Whatever happens with my dad and stepmom from here, I know I did what was right for me and my mom's legacy. I'll update again if anything changes, but for now, the cabin is back where it belongs. Thank you to everyone who supported me on this journey. Update 5. After countless hours of work, the final touches on the cabin were complete. The place looked better than ever, with fresh paint, sturdy repairs, and small upgrades here and there. I'd put so much time and effort into restoring it, and seeing it fully finished brought a quiet sense of closure. The cabin felt whole again, like it was honoring my mom's memory in the way I'd always hoped. I decided to keep the cabin as a retreat, somewhere to escape to when life got too busy. It wasn't just a place to remember my mom, it had become a symbol of independence and resilience. I knew that no matter what else happened in my life, this cabin was mine, and it was here to stay. After the fallout with my dad and stepmom, contact with them became minimal. My dad and I were civil enough when we did talk, but the relationship was different now. There was an unspoken acceptance between us that we might never go back to how things were. My stepmom completely distanced herself, and I accepted that too. In a way, letting go of the need to fix things with them gave me peace. Not every family story ends in reconciliation, and I was okay with that. With my dad and stepmom out of the picture, my connection with the extended family grew stronger. My mom's side of the family had been there for me every step of the way, and their support made us closer than we'd been in years. We started planning family gatherings at the cabin, and it felt like a new beginning for all of us. They saw the cabin as a piece of her legacy too, and their visits turned it into a shared space full of new memories. Reflecting on everything, I realized this journey had changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I'd learned about betrayal, resilience, and the meaning of family. The cabin had been a battle, but it was also a turning point in my life. For the first time, I felt like I'd taken control of my future instead of letting others decide it for me. And the cabin, once just a place to escape to, became a symbol of that growth. I shared an update on Reddit, thanking everyone who'd supported me through the entire journey. The outpouring of encouragement and advice had been invaluable. People had shared their own stories, helped me strategize, and even donated to make the cabin a reality again. I wouldn't have been able to do it without that community, and I wanted them to know how much it meant to me. The comments poured in, full of congratulations and even more personal stories from people who'd gone through similar family conflicts. My friends, who'd supported me both financially and emotionally, became like family in their own right. They were there for me when things got rough, and they stuck around long after the battle was won. I knew I'd never forget what they'd done for me. We started making plans to create new traditions at the cabin, with annual get-togethers and camping trips to keep the place alive with laughter and friendship. One afternoon, I decided to set up a small tribute to my mom in one corner of the cabin. I dedicated a cozy reading nook to her, filled with some of her favorite books and a few old family photos. It felt like the right way to keep her memory alive, without turning the cabin into a shrine. Whenever I sat in that corner, it felt like she was right there with me, and it gave me a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. The cabin project became a journey of personal healing. I'd started out focused on the physical restoration, but somewhere along the way, I ended up restoring parts of myself too. The experience taught me a lot about letting go, setting boundaries, and standing up for what matters. It was a long road, but one that left me stronger and more grounded than I'd ever been. The story spread online, drawing attention from people outside Reddit. Random strangers messaged me, sharing similar stories about family conflicts, loss, and the fight to hold onto memories. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone in this kind of struggle. The cabin story had resonated far beyond my small circle, connecting with people who'd faced similar challenges. It was a strange kind of fame, but it brought me peace knowing others could relate. A few weeks after the cabin was finished, we held a celebration event with friends and family. It wasn't anything fancy, just a gathering to mark the end of the long journey. We set up tables outside, had a big BBQ, and shared stories under the stars. There was laughter, music, and a sense of community that I hadn't felt in years. It was a moment of pure happiness, and I knew my mom would have loved it. Not long after the celebration, my dad reached out. It was a brief meeting, and there wasn't much closure. He expressed regret, but stopped short of an apology. It felt like his way of acknowledging what had happened without diving too deep into it. I didn't press for more. We'd both moved on, and I accepted that some things might never fully heal. It was bittersweet, but it was enough. With the cabin restored and the family drama finally settled, I was ready to start a new chapter. This journey had taught me more than I could have imagined, and I was grateful for every lesson. The cabin now stood as a testament to my strength, my family's support, and my mom's legacy. For everyone who followed this story from the beginning, thank you. This experience reminded me of the power of community, and it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Here's to new beginnings, old memories, and the cabin that brought them all together.